我们先请陈老师呢来为我们，来为我们介绍一下我们今天的讲员Tremper朗曼三世博士，然后呢也由陈老师来为我们做一个开场的祷告。有请陈老师。
好，谢谢。我们一起来祷告。亲爱的主耶稣，我们感谢你，今天让我们有这样一个宝贵的时间，可以从你自己的话语里面来学习你要我们听到的信息。主，我们知道我们人生中每一件事情你都命定，就是我们在母胎中你也已经认识我们。主啊，我们所度过的每一天每一日每一年每一岁，主啊，你都清楚。主啊，在你这样全知的大能中，主啊，我们心里面怎么可能不畏惧？主啊，求你帮助我们能够认识你就是我们的神，你就是我们的父。主啊，让我们能够把自己的一生完全的来依靠你，在我们每天所做的每一样事情中，能够降服在你自己的旨意中，因为我们知道你是爱我们，彻底的爱我们，因为你愿意爱我们到一个地步，你愿意为我们死在十字架上，为我们的罪付出代价。主啊，谢谢你，求你预备我们的心，在我们听下面信息的时候能够得到帮助，能够得到勉励，在我们现今所处的环境里能够看到你的话语是很实际，能够给我们提供力量帮助的。谢谢主，垂听我们的祷告，祝福我们下面1个多小时的聚会，奉主耶稣基督圣名，阿们。今天我很荣幸的能够来这里介绍我们的讲员朗曼博士。朗曼博士是福音派的一个非常著名的学者，他有非常多的著作，也发表了非常多的文章。他其实不单是旧约熟悉他新约也非常熟悉。他在 TTi 的服事里面帮我们教过但以理书、传道书、雅歌。其实我们还可以继续邀请他来教导其他的书籍但是很感恩因为我们已经有3卷了，以后或者还有更多的机会。好，我不说太多了，我就把下面的时间交给我们的讲员朗曼博士。我们请我们的姊妹来为他翻译。
Hi, Dr. Longman. It's your time now. Please unmute your audio and turn your video on.
Thank you very much, Jansen, and nice to see you this evening. For me, it's evening. For you, it's morning in Beijing.
Thank you for coming to us.
谢谢刚刚的介绍，也跟大家说一声早上好，在他那里，在老师那里是晚上好。
And it's a great privilege. I live in Washington, D.C. area, in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. So it's a little later here in the evening, but I wish you a good morning.
我是住在美国弗吉尼亚州的华盛顿特区附近，在我这边是晚上，所以我要跟你们说早上好。
And I've had the wonderful opportunity of working with TTi for a number of years, having visited Hong Kong to teach there, most recently in 2016.
我很荣幸，之前跟 TTi 有好几年的合作的时间，也曾经去过香港来授课，最近的一次是在2016年。
And for about 6 or 7 years, I went every year to Beijing to teach at Beida, the University of Peking, in a program that they had going for a while.
大概有6、7年的时间，我每一年都会去北京讲课，是去北大授课，是跟他们的一个项目合作。
And so as I teach tonight about the book of Daniel for today and how to live in a culture toxic to our faith, I've been to Beijing, I've been to China. Of course, I read about China, but China is not my culture.
今天晚上要跟大家分享的信息是但以理书对当下的意义，就是如何活在有害于信仰的文化当中。虽然我去过北京，也跟就是也来过中国其他地方，但是毕竟中国的文化不是我所在的文化。
So I don't want to be so presumptuous as to claim that I know what you're going through, but there is one thing I know.
所以我不敢说我非常清楚的了解你们所经历的，但是有一件事是我知道的。
That every culture is toxic to our faith, including the American culture where I live.
就是每一种文化它都是有害于我们的信仰的，包括我所在的美国文化。
There is a myth that America is a Christian nation, and I praise God that Christianity has had an influence on America, but still it's not a Christian nation, and so the topic, how to live in a culture toxic to our faith, is relevant for every culture.
有一个迷思说美国是基督教国家，但它是受到基督教很多的影响，但它其实并不是一个基督教国家，所以这个每一个文化都是需要学习，就是但以理书里面说的如何活在有害于信仰的文化当中。
And I think we can all, no matter where we live, get some insight into how to live in a culture toxic to our faith from the book of Daniel.
所以我们每一个文化，不管是处在美国、中国，我们都可以从但以理书当中学习到如何活在这样一个有害于信仰的文化当中。
And at first, this might seem unlikely because the world at the time that Daniel was writing is so different from our world, whether we live in China, whether we live in the United States, or even in Israel. It's a much different world than the ones we're familiar with.
但是初听你这句话，你会觉得是不是有点难理解？因为我们现在所生活的文化，不管是中国还是美国，跟当时的这个世界是很不一样的。
And as I will emphasize, Daniel is very much writing to his contemporaries. He's addressing issues that his contemporaries are dealing with.
但我要强调的是，但以理书他写给的对象是他的当代人，是他们当时代的人所面对的问题。
However, and also, part of that difference is that Daniel lived in a time before the coming of Jesus Christ, and we live in a time after the coming of Jesus Christ.
还有一个差异就是，但以理书是在基督来临之前，而我们是生活在基督来临之后的时代。
And to some people, that means that not only Daniel, but the whole Old Testament is irrelevant to our faith today.
不仅是但以理书，有些人甚至认为整部旧约跟我们今日的生活都没有什么关系。
However, this repeats an ancient heresy associated with a man named Marcion who lived in the 2nd century, who said that the Old Testament was not relevant to our faith.
其实这是一个古代的异端，来自于2世纪的时候，一个叫马吉安的人，他认为旧约是跟我们当下的生活没有关系的。
And indeed, we have to be sensitive to the fact that the coming of Jesus does, in many ways, affect how we read and apply the Old Testament to us today, but it is still extremely relevant for our lives.
我们确实要敏锐的知道，基督的来临对于我们如何解读旧约是有一些更新或者是影响，但是我们还是要知道旧约跟我们是密切相关的。
So, how is Daniel relevant for us today?
所以说，但以理书跟我们今天有什么关系呢？
Some believe it's relevant because it speaks of God's coming at the end of time.
有人认为，它跟我们相关，是因为它涉及到主再来的那个末世。
Some even believe that the main message of the book of Daniel, especially the second half, is to give us a prediction of the second coming and maybe even to give us hints as to when Christ is coming again.
有的人是根据但以理书的特别是后半部分来说，但以理书是一个预言，就是基督二次降临，而且具体是什么时候降临。
I don't believe it's true that Daniel or any part of the Bible gives us hints that will allow us to predict when Jesus is coming again.
我是不同意这个观点的。我认为，不论是但以理书还是圣经其他的地方，都没有给我们任何暗示说基督会什么时候再来。
And it certainly is talking about how God is going to come at the end of time and is going to save his people from the toxic cultures in which they live.
但他确实讲到，神在末世要来临，拯救他的百姓脱离这些有害的文化。
But its message, as I say, is directed to his contemporaries. And actually, Daniel speaks to us today as it is spoken to every generation. Its message, while directed to his contemporaries, is as relevant today and as it has been through all the centuries.
虽然这个信息是但以理讲给他当代人听的，但是他对我们今日也照样说话，就像他对我们以前的每一个世代的人说话一样。
So what is the message of the book of Daniel?
所以但以理书的信息是什么呢？
I will state the message of the book of Daniel, and I will then show how it works out in a couple chapters.
我会讲一下但以理书的信息，然后举其中的几章的例子来说明。
The main message of the book of Daniel is telling his readers that in spite of present trouble, that is, we live in a toxic culture, God is in control, and we will have the final victory.
但以理书的主要信息是，尽管眼下艰难，因为我们是生活在一个有害于信仰的文化当中，但是神仍在掌权，并且我们终将得胜。
And when we look at Daniel 1, we'll see that the present trouble for Daniel and his generation is that the Babylonians is oppressing the people of Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah.
我们在但以理书第1章可以看到，但以理书他面对的读者，他们正在承受着压迫，因为巴比伦的压迫，就是压制，因为当时南国犹大已经被掳了，是当时以色列人所面临的这样的一个困境。
Nebuchadnezzar has made Judah and its capital Jerusalem become a vassal of the Babylonian Empire.
当时尼布甲尼撒使犹大的都城耶路撒冷也成为巴比伦帝国的一个臣属。
Yes, and so matter of fact, let me read the first couple verses of Daniel chapter 1. It says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God."
但以理书的1章1到2节，犹大王约雅敬在位第3年，巴比伦王尼布甲尼撒来到耶路撒冷，将城围困。主将犹大王约雅敬并神殿中器皿的几份交付他手，他就把这器皿带到示拿地，收入他神的庙里，放在他神的库中。
The year is 605 BC.
时间是在公元前605年。
And Nebuchadnezzar has just become the king of Babylon.
尼布甲尼撒刚刚成为巴比伦的王。
And he has besieged Jerusalem and have made them become a vassal of his empire.
他围困了耶路撒冷，使耶路撒冷成为这个巴比伦帝国的一个臣属。
And in typical ancient Near Eastern fashion, Judah and its capital Jerusalem has to show its subservience to Babylon by turning over something from the temple. Typically, a nation would have to give an idol of their main god to their conquerors, but since Judah does not have any idols, and the Ark of the Covenant no longer exists, Nebuchadnezzar takes some of the articles from the temple, and that's a sign of submission to Babylon.
通常在古近东的文化当中，为了表示，臣属国通常为了表示忠诚顺服，要将他们的神或者偶像要交给就是东道国，以表示他们的臣服。但是因为以色列他们是没有偶像的，没有神的像，所以尼布甲尼撒就拿了神殿中的一些器皿拿过去，也表示犹大对他们的忠诚。
So you see, in spite of present trouble, it looks like Babylon is in control.
所以在当下的艰难的处境当中，看上去掌权的是巴比伦。
But right from the start, the book of Daniel is communicating to its readers that God is the one who's really in control.
但是在但以理书一开始，作者就跟读者表示，其实是神在掌权。
Notice what it says in verse 2. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand.
然后在第2节里面讲到是主将犹大王约雅敬交付他手。
So Nebuchadnezzar thinks it's his power that did it, but actually God has done it. We know from other books he's allowed this to happen because of the sin of his people.
所以尼布甲尼撒以为是他自己的权势做到了这一点，但是其实是神的能力将他们交在尼布甲尼撒的手里，为要对付刑罚他百姓的罪。
So as we read through the book of Daniel, the 6 stories in the first 6 chapters, which talks about Daniel and his 3 friends in foreign courts, and then the last 6 chapters, which have 4 visions of the future, every one of them illustrates this theme of, in spite of present trouble, God is in control, and God will have the final victory.
在但以理书的前面6章有讲了6个故事，讲的是但以理书和他的3个朋友在异邦的宫廷里面所发生的。后面的几章内容讲到了4个意象，是关乎未来的，但无论是哪里，它里面都透露的这样的一个主题是：尽管眼下艰难，但是神仍在掌权，并且我们终将得胜。
Another lesson that was repeated a number of times in the book of Daniel is to encourage the people who are living in exile, people who are living in a toxic culture, encouraging them that they can survive and even thrive in toxic cultures.
还有一个反复出现的主题，就是要鼓励当时面对这些处境的读者以色列人，就是他们即使是在有害的文化当中，仍然能够存活甚至兴旺。
But this isn't a call to culture war, which is a phenomenon in the United States where some Christians think they have to fight the culture or try to take over the culture. No, rather, it's a call for God's people to remain faithful in spite of the culture, even willing to be humiliated and suffer.
但是这并不表示他们蒙召是要去打一场文化的战争，就像在北美的一个现象，就是有些人认为我们要对抗文化，甚至是接管统管文化。其实对我们对读者的呼召是，无论在怎样的文化当中，神的子民都必须要持守忠心，甚至到甘愿被羞辱受苦的地步。
Now, I want to illustrate this theme by taking a close look at Daniel chapter 1.
我想通过但以理书第1章来看，来讲述这些主题。
And as I do, I want to pay close attention to how Daniel is interacting with his toxic culture.
通过第1章，我们要来看看但以理是如何与当时的有害的文化来互动的。
As we watch Daniel and the three friends here, we are amazed that he very wisely navigates his reaction to the culture around him, the pagan culture around him.
我们通过看但以理和他的3个朋友，我们发现他们是非常有智慧的来回应当时的这样的一个异教的文化。
So he's not always going to fight back. He is sometimes simply going to accept what the Babylonians are doing because he trusts God and he knows that God is in control.
他们不是仅仅的很简单的反击，而是接受当时巴比伦的一些现状，因为他们相信是神在掌权。
So we've read Daniel 1:1 to 2. Let me now read Daniel 1:3 to 5 and talk about going to what I call Babylon University.
我们看过了1到2节，现在来看1章的3到5节，来讲他们是上了巴比伦大学的这样的一个事情。
So verse 3 to 5 says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter into the king's service.
王吩咐太监长亚士毗拿从以色列人的宗室和贵胄中带进几个人来，就是年少没有残疾，相貌俊美，通达各样学问，知识聪明具备，足能侍立在王宫里的，要教他们加勒底的文字言语。王派定将自己所用的膳和所饮的酒，每日赐他们1份，养他们3年，满了3年，好叫他们在王面前侍立。
So let me begin by saying that this too is typical of the ancient Near East.
我要首先也要再次说明，这在古近东文化当中也是非常典型的。
When a powerful nation caused a less powerful nation like Judah to become a vassal, one of the things they would do is to take some of the upper class, the nobles of that vassal kingdom, and bring them back to the center of Babylon in this case, and then educate them in Babylonian ways.
就是当一个大国征服了小国的时候，大国就会将小国里面的一些上层阶层或者是一些贵族带到在这里是巴比伦王国，然后对他们进行巴比伦文化的教育。
Their purpose, of course, their intention is to make them Babylonian in their thinking, so that if they go back to their nation, they will be supportive of, in this case, Babylon, or if, like with Daniel and the three friends, they stay in Babylon, that they will help, help the Babylonian Empire within the internal state apparatus.
他们这样做的目的是为了使他们这些贵族他们的思想能够巴比伦化，然后所以不管是他们回到本国，他们还是会支持巴比伦，或者是他们像但以理和他的朋友待在巴比伦的话，那好让他们可以帮助巴比伦的一些内政的事务。
And so what's particularly interesting is to think about what Daniel and his three friends would have studied at Babylon University.
所以我们来想但以理和他的3个朋友在这个巴比伦大学学了什么，到底学的内容是什么，是挺有意思的。
And we know something about the educational system in Babylon at this time.
我们知道当时巴比伦教育系统的一些方面。
I did my Ph.D. years ago at Yale University on ancient Babylonian culture.
我在多年前在耶鲁大学做的博士论文就是关于古巴比伦文化。
And we actually have a lot of ancient texts that have been discovered through archaeology in what is today Iraq, because that's where Babylon was located in Iraq today. And we know what they studied.
我们能够在古巴比伦的那个遗址上面找到一些古代的，通过考古找到一些古代的文本，但是现在那些地方都只是岩石留下来，只剩下这些了。
And it was a curriculum, again, that was toxic to their faith.
这里面的那些文本内容肯定是有害于他们信仰的一些课程。
In verse 4, it says they learned the language and literature of the Babylonians.
在第4节里面说，他们要学巴比伦人的文字言语。
So they would have studied ancient Babylonian creation texts, which would have praised their god Marduk as the creator of the universe.
所以他们要学习巴比伦人的创造故事，里面会赞颂巴比伦人所尊为的那个马尔杜克神。
They would have read the Gilgamesh epic, which talks about the flood, but it wasn't Noah who went into the ark, but a man named Utnapishtim.
他们还会讲到，在那个吉尔加吉美史诗里面讲到，洪水，但并不是挪亚，我们读到的挪亚的洪水，而是另外一个人的名字。
They also would have been trained in divination,
而且他们也会受训去占卜，
which would include astrology and reading the internal organs of animals to find out about the future.
就是通过读星象或者是读动物的内脏来预示未来会发生什么事情。
And they would have learned how to interpret dreams.
他们也要学习如何解读梦象。
And we'll take a quick look at Daniel 2 in a moment when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that no one seems to be able to interpret.
后面我们会 讲到的第2章里面，尼布甲尼撒做了一个梦，但是没有人能够解读。
But right now, I just want to comment that even though this curriculum was toxic to their faith, Daniel and the 3 friends obviously didn't resist going to Babylonian University. And indeed, at the end of the chapter, they are praised by Nebuchadnezzar for being the best in the class.
但是这里我们要看到这里的巴比伦的课程是有害于以色列人的信仰的这样的一些文化的内容，但是我们看到但以理和他的3个朋友，他们并没有对此表示出抵抗，而且在这章最后我们也看到他们是在这些少年人当中是最受赞美的，是最厉害的。
Of course, Daniel and 3 friends are faithful worshipers of the true God. They would have found this curriculum toxic to their faith.
当然但以理和他3个朋友是忠于神的，他们肯定知道这些内容是有害于他们的信仰的。
They wouldn't have believed what they were learning, but they still learned their lessons and didn't object.
所以他们肯定不会相信这些教授的内容，但是他们仍然去学习这一些内容。
Then in verse 6 and 7, we read that their names were changed as well.
在6到7节，我们看到他们的名字也被改了。
Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego.
他们中间有犹大族的人，但以理、汉纳尼亚、米沙利、亚撒利亚。太监长给他们起名，称但以理为伯提沙撒，称哈拿尼亚为沙德拉，称米沙利为米沙，称亚撒利亚为亚伯尼哥。
Now, of course, in the ancient world, names had great significance.
在古代世界，名字是有非常重要的意义。
And they were always connected to their God.
总是与他们的所信奉的神相关联。
So the name Daniel means God is my judge.
所以但以理这个名字的意思是神是我的审判者。
But the Babylonians say, no, we're not going to call you Daniel. We're going to call you Belteshazzar.
但是巴比伦人说，我们不会叫你但以理，我们要叫你伯提沙撒。
Which means the divine lady protects the king.
意思就是神圣的夫人或者女士保护王。
Without looking at all the names, the bottom line, though, is all their good Hebrew names, which praise the true God, are changed to pagan names, which praise false gods.
我们不用一个解释这个名字的意思，但是其实就是把这几个很好的赞美希伯来神的这个名字改成了赞美异教神的名字。
And once again, they don't make a stand on this. They don't say, do not call us by these pagan names.
在这里我们也没有看到他们站出来说不要叫我们的异教名字。
And I'm sure they didn't like them. And when they were alone and when they called each other by their Hebrew names, but they knew that if they objected, that they would probably be killed.
我想他们肯定是不喜欢这些新的名字，他们私底下可能互相叫也是叫原来的名字，但是他们也知道如果他们反对的话可能会被杀。
And we know that these men would be willing to die for their faith, because if you look at Daniel 3, the 3 friends are unwilling to bend the knee to this idol that Nebuchadnezzar puts up.
当然我们知道这几个人他们是甘愿为信仰而死的，因为在第3章里面我们就看到但以理的3个朋友，他因为不愿意向尼布甲尼撒向下拜而受到了一些逼迫。
What I think we're learning here is that not everything not that there are certain things that people of faith just simply cannot do, even if it means humiliation, marginalization, or death.
我们能够看到的是，有一些事情是信主的人不能做的，即使这些事情会带来羞辱，会使我们被边缘化，甚至是被杀。
But that's not true of everything.
但是不是每一件事都不可以。
However, it's interesting where Daniel and his 3 friends choose to draw the line and refuse to do what the king tells them to do.
所以很值得我们注意的是，但以理和他的朋友是在哪一些事上画了一条界限，选择不听从巴比伦人的吩咐。
And it has to do with the food that the king wants them to eat.
包括王要他们吃的食物。
So maybe I'll just ask that Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 through 16 be read in Chinese.
OK， 但以理书1章的8到16节。但以理却立志不以王的膳和王所饮的酒玷污自己，所以求太监长容他不玷污自己。神使但以理在太监长眼前蒙恩惠受怜悯。太监长对但以理说：“我惧怕我主我王，他已经派定你们的饮食。倘若他见你们的面貌比你们同岁的少年人肌瘦，怎么好呢？这样你们就使我的头在王那里难保。”但以理对太监长所派管理但以理、哈拿尼亚、米沙利、亚撒利亚的委办说：“求你试试仆人们10天，给我们素菜吃，白水喝，然后看看我们的面貌和用王膳那少年人的面貌，就照你所看的待仆人吧。”王委办便允准他们这件事，试看他们10天。过了10天，见他们的面貌比用王膳的一切少年人更加俊美肥胖，于是委办撤去派他们用的膳、饮的酒，给他们素菜吃。
So here they draw the line. They won't eat the food or drink the wine.
这里他们就表明了自己的立场，他们不愿意吃王给的食物，还有给的酒。
Now notice that this protest is done in private.
但是你要注意到，这个是私底下做的一个抵抗。
And we have to ask, why are they refusing to eat the food and drink the wine?
我们会问他们为什么不肯吃那食物，不肯饮那酒。
And some people think it's because they want to keep kosher, that they want to observe the food laws that you find, say, in Leviticus chapter 11.
有的人说他们是为了保持自己的洁净，为了遵守利未记11章里面讲到的那些食物洁净食物的律例。
But this doesn't seem right because for a couple reasons. One is there's nothing unclean about drinking wine, and there's nothing about the food that we know that would put it in the category of being unclean food.
这种说法应该是不对的，有好几个原因，2个原因。第一个原因是因为我们知道酒并不是不洁净的，而且这里的食物可能也不全都是不洁净的。
As a matter of fact, if you go to Daniel 10, verse 3, we see that Daniel has a disturbing vision, and he says, I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips. So it appears that this refusal to eat choice food or drink wine is a temporary one during this period of time when they're at Babylonian University.
因为我们从后面的10章3节里面看到但以理说，美味我没有吃，酒肉也没有入我的口，所以我们可以看到在第1章这里，他们上巴比伦大学的时候，这个不吃他们的食物，不饮他们的酒，只是暂时的做法。
So bottom line is well, first of all, to know why this is significant, we first of all have to know something about why Nebuchadnezzar is wanting wants them to eat this food and drink the wine.
要知道他们这么做的意义，我们首先要知道为什么尼布甲尼撒要他们吃这些食物喝这些酒。
And something that the original audience would have known right away, but we can learn by looking at artistic representations from ancient Babylon, is that wise men in Babylon were not thin, they were not muscular, they were kind of what we call chubby.
所以我们对于当时的原初读者来说，他们是很容易明白背后的原因，但是我们是可以从古巴比伦的一些艺术作品上面看到，因为当时古巴比伦的哲士他们不是以就是很精瘦或者是很有肌肉而著称，他们是很圆润的。
Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to be pleasingly chubby, and that's why Ashpenaz was afraid that if they just ate vegetables and drank water, that they would not be robust, they would not be well nourished.
所以亚士匹拿他就担心，如果不给他们吃，他们看上去没有这么的健壮，没有这么的圆润的话，就不太好。
So Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's in control, and he's trying to give them a diet that will make them look like the wise men he wants them to look like.
所以尼布甲以为是他在掌控这一切，他希望这些哲士他们长的样子，身材，是他所想要他们呈现出的样子。
But by not eating that rich food and drinking the wine, and only eating vegetables and water, they're showing that God is in control, not Nebuchadnezzar.
但是他们通过不吃这些丰盛的食物，不饮酒，只吃素菜，来表明是神在掌权，而不是尼布甲尼撒。
Because you see in verse 15, after the 10-day trial, they looked, according to verse 15, looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food.
因为在15节里面，我们看到过了10天，他们的面貌比用王膳的一切少年人更加的俊美肥胖。
And indeed, at the end of chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar looks at these 4 men and he say, "You are the best in the class."
在第1章的最后，我们也看到尼布甲尼撒对这4个人说：“你们是这些少年人当中最优秀的。”
And so he thinks he's in control, that he has made them wise men, and he has, through his diet, made them look so healthy and well nourished.
所以尼布甲尼撒以为他在掌控这一切，是他使他们成为很有智慧的哲士，是他使他们能够有这样的俊美肥胖。
But Daniel and the 3 friends and everybody who reads this story knows that it's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's God who is in control.
但是但以理和他的3个朋友，以及我们读到这些故事的读者知道，不是尼布甲尼撒，而是神在掌权。
And he will have the final victory. And as we said, you not only can survive in a toxic culture, you can thrive, because at the end they are honored for being the best in the class.
所以我们知道是他们不仅是在我们知道神最终一定会得胜，而且这些人他们不只是存活，而且能够兴旺，因为我们在这里看到最后他们受到很大的尊荣。
Now, real quickly, I will comment on chapter 2.
我会很快的提到第2章。
Because at the end of chapter 1, they're recognized for being wise men, and they've done really well in Nebuchadnezzar's university.
你在第1章最后，我们看到但以理和他3个朋友在这所巴比伦大学里面是非常的优秀而毕业的。
So the idea is Nebuchadnezzar thinks I've made them the wise men that they are, but that included dream interpretation.
但尼布甲尼撒以为是他使这些人成为这么有智慧的哲士，那其中这些内容学的也包括解梦。
So let me tell you a little bit about how Babylonians did dream interpretation.
那我来讲一下巴比伦人是怎么解梦的。
So when somebody has a dream, like Nebuchadnezzar has in chapter 2, he tells the interpreter the dream.
就比如有人做了梦，就像尼布甲尼撒在第2章做梦的情况，他就会把这个梦告诉那些解梦的人。
Then the wise men who's trained in dream interpretation goes and consults commentaries and the commentaries help them understand the significance of the symbolism of a dream.
这些哲士他们听完之后，就是照着他们解梦的这些注释书，然后来解读这些梦当中的符号。
This is why in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar refuses to tell the Babylonian wise men the contents of his dream, they're going, well, we can't help you because that's not the way dream interpretation is done.
所以在第2章，当尼布甲尼撒要那些解梦的人把梦的内容告诉他们的时候，他们就无能为力，说这个我们做不了，这不是我们解梦人能做的事情。
So Nebuchadnezzar says, kill them all the wise men.
所以尼布甲尼撒就说把这些所有的哲士都杀了。
But when the executioner comes to Daniel and the 3 friends, they pray and God reveals to them the dream and its interpretation.
当这些人要抓但以理和他朋友，也要将他们杀的时候，他们就祷告，然后神将梦的内容向但以理显现。
So the bottom line is that Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2 show that it's not Nebuchadnezzar who's in control. It's not Nebuchadnezzar who makes them look healthy. It's not Nebuchadnezzar who gives them wisdom. It's God who does it.
所以第1章、第2章内容告诉我们，不是尼布甲尼撒使他们看上去健美肥壮，而也不是他使他们特别的有智慧，而是神。
So again, in spite of present difficulties, it's God who's in control. He will have the final victory, and God's people can not only survive in a toxic culture, but can actually thrive in a toxic culture.
所以尽管眼下艰难，但神仍在掌权，他终将得胜。而且我们不仅可以在有害的文化当中存活，甚至还可以兴旺。
We're running out of time, and I know you're going to be studying the book of Daniel for the next few weeks. So I'll simply say that those visions in the second half of the book also have this same theme of, in spite of present difficulties, God is in control and he will have the final victory.
我知道你们接下来还有几周的时间会开这个但以理书的课，所以时间也到了，我就简单的讲一下后面的意象，它所呈现的也是一样的主题，就是尽管眼下艰难，但是神仍在掌权，而且他最终将得胜。
So when you study Daniel 7, for instance, you'll see that the present trouble is symbolized by these horrific beasts that arise out of a sea.
从第7章里面，我们可以看到意象里面可以看到这些兽，海中的兽，它其实就象征了处境的艰难。
And you'll study how these beasts represent evil human kingdoms. And rather than trying to identify 4 specific kingdoms, it's really simply saying that from the time of Daniel all the way till the end of history, there will be evil nation states representing toxic cultures all the way to the end.
它里面讲到这兽是代表了4个罪恶的人的国度，那我们不用去一一的对应，但是我们知道它其实代表的 是从但以理时代直至历史终结的所有的有害文化。
But in the second half of the vision talks about one like the Son of Man riding a cloud into the presence of the Ancient of Days and going out and defeating those beasts.
在这第7章的后半部分9到14节讲到了有一位像人子的驾云来到亘古常在者，他击败了那一些兽。
In other words, the message to Daniel's contemporaries, as well as to every generation since, including ours, is in spite of present difficulties, you live in cultures that are dominated by these beasts that represent evil human kingdoms.
所以这是对但以理的当代的读者，包括他之后的所有的读者，包括我们，就是尽管眼下艰难，这个艰难其实就是我们就是活在这些兽所代表的有害的文化当中。
But remember, God is really in control, and He will have the final victory.
但是要记得，真的是神在掌权，他会夺得最终的胜利。
And so, and as we turn to the New Testament, we see that Jesus is the one like the Son of Man.
到新约，我们就知道耶稣是那位人子。
And when Jesus dies on the cross and is raised, according to Paul in Colossians 2:13 to 15, he defeats the spiritual powers.
我们从哥罗西书的2章13到15节里面可以看到，耶稣他死里复活，在十字架上打败了属灵的权势。
And this assures the final victory, which is described in the book of Revelation.
这个也就显明了启示录所表明的耶稣的最终得胜。
You see, the book of Revelation is very similar to the book of Daniel.
我们可以看到启示录跟但以理书有很多相似的地方。
And it has the same theme, which is in spite of present difficulties, God is really in control, and He will certainly have the final victory.
他们有相同的主题，就是虽然世事艰难，但是神仍在掌权，并且最终将得胜。
So, what's the message to us today?
所以对于我们今日这个信息是什么呢？
Because God is in control and will have the final victory, we should live with confidence and hope in the midst of a toxic culture.
正因为神在掌权，他终将得胜，所以我们要在有害的文化当中过信心和盼望的生活。
And we need to stay faithful, even when that toxic culture humiliates, marginalizes, and persecutes us.
所以我们而且要持守忠心，即使我们遭受羞辱、边缘化或者是逼迫。
In other words, we should be like our Lord Jesus Christ, who himself was humiliated, marginalized, and persecuted.
换句话说，就是我们要像我们的主耶稣基督一样，因为他自己就遭受了羞辱，被边缘化，而且被逼迫。
But defeats the spiritual powers and authorities on the cross and will win a great victory at the end of the age.
但是如果在十字架上，靠着他打败属灵权势，那么在最终就将得胜。
So those are some thoughts that I want to share with you tonight as you begin your study of the book of Daniel.
所以在你们开始学习但以理书的信息之前，晚上我就跟你们分享一下前面讲的这些内容。
So thank you so much for your attention tonight, or this morning for you.
所以谢谢大家今天早上的这个时间来听这部分内容。